The mountains of West Virginia hold their silence like a kept secret. Calhoun County, 1884. A ridge above a hollow no map bothers to name. A long, low building stands at the top, older than anyone living, built to a design nobody else in the county ever thought to copy. Inside it, nothing. 12 years of nothing. Then a wagon comes up the switchbacks in the cold October light. A young woman drives it alone. In the bed behind her, 1,000 chicks nobody wanted. The men at the auction barn gave her a week, maybe less. They were wrong about what she was carrying. They were wrong about what that building was waiting for. They were wrong about her. She walks into that empty building, sets down the first flat, and stands still in the dark. Something is about to begin that will take 4 years to understand, and cost everything in between. Now, here is her story. The morning of the auction, there were 1,000 chicks nobody wanted. They sat in a stack of shallow cardboard flats at the back of the Calhoun County livestock barn, peeping in that thin, uneven way that chicks peep when they are cold and underfed, and the men gathered around the front pens did not bother to walk back and look. Word had already gone around. The hatchery up in Tennessee had a bad week, something with the incubators running too cool, and the batch had hatched late in week. 2 had already gone still in the flat closest to the door. The auctioneer had tried to sell them as one lot at the start of the morning and gotten no bids. He had tried again at half price. Then he had set them aside and moved on to the calves, which was where the real money was, and which was where Court Dillard was standing in his clean wool coat, with his thumbs hooked into his belt loops, like a man who had never once in his life had to wait for anything. Willa Breck came in around 9, 22 years old, narrow through the shoulders, hair tied back under a feed store cap that had belonged to somebody else first. Most of the men in the barn knew her only as Opal Breck's granddaughter, the one who had come back from Morgantown after her mother passed and was living up at the old place on Slateback Hollow Road by herself. She walked past the calf pens without stopping, past the goats, all the way to the back where the cardboard flats sat under a lamp hung from a roof beam, and she crouched down on her heels and looked at those 1,000 chicks for a long time without saying anything. Long enough that Taj Munro, the auctioneer's helper, a boy of 17, who could not have been more than that, came over and asked if she was all right. She said she was. She asked what the hatchery wanted for the lot. He told her they had said anything, just take them. They would be cold by noon. She stood, walked to the office, came back 10 minutes later with a receipt for $40 and a borrowed handcart, and began loading those flats one at a time into the bed of a wagon older than she was. Court Dillard watched her from across the barn, with the half-smile of a man who has just been handed a story to tell at supper. He waited until she had loaded the last flat, then walked over and said, loud enough for the 3 men beside him to hear every word, you know those things are going to be dead by Sunday. Willa closed the tailgate. That's one approach. He laughed at that. Sweetheart, that ain't an approach. That's a fact. She climbed onto the wagon bench and drove out of the lot without looking back. Court Dillard turned to the men beside him and shook his head slowly. That girl just paid $40 for 1,000 funerals. He meant it as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. She drove the 35 miles back to Slateback Hollow Road, with the canvas flap on the wagon bed lifted at the corners so the chicks would have air, and the peeping rose and fell behind her like weather. The road climbed past the old Ewan place, crossed the creek twice, then narrowed into gravel switchbacks that led up the ridge where her grandfather Silas had built the farmhouse in 1851 from chestnut salvaged from a barn that had stood on the same footprint for 60 years before him. The house was still standing. Most everything else was not. The big tobacco barn had collapsed in on itself 2 winters back. The smokehouse leaned hard to the east. The chicken house, a long, low building of board and batten that Silas had built specifically and stubbornly to a design nobody else in the county used, was still upright, though it had not held a living bird in 12 years. Willa parked the wagon at the edge of the yard and carried the flats one by one into that long, low building, set them on the wooden floor her grandfather had laid, stood there in the cool and the dim, the smell of old straw and older wood rising around her, and listened to 1,000 chicks she'd paid $40 for. She did not feel afraid exactly, but she felt the weight of the thing settle onto her shoulders the way a coat settles when you have been carrying it folded over your arm for too long. She had come back to Slateback Hollow in March, after her mother's funeral, not because she had a plan, but because there was nowhere else that felt like it would hold her. Her grandmother Opal was 81 and lived in the small frame house at the bottom of the ridge, and the big house on top, the one Silas had built, had been sitting empty since he died. Willa moved into it with 2 valises and a box of her mother's books, and spent the first month simply walking the property, learning where the springs ran and where the deer crossed, sitting on the porch in the evenings watching the light leave the mountains. She had not known in March what she was going to do with any of it. She had only known that the city had not held her either, that the small inheritance her mother had left was not going to last forever, and that something would have to be made of this place or it would go the way of the tobacco barn. The chicks had not been her plan. She had gone to the auction that morning to look at a milk cow she could not afford and come home with 1,000 sick birds instead. If you had asked her, standing in that long, low building, why she had done it, She could not have given you an answer that would have satisfied Court Dillard or anybody like him. She could only have said that she had crouched down and looked at them and seen something the rest of the barn had not seen, which was that they were not dying. They were only cold and hungry and the wrong color for what people wanted, which was the bright industrial yellow of a healthy Cornish cross. These were a mixed lot of heritage breeds the hatchery had been trying to clear out, mottled and dun and rust-colored, with the wrong leg coloring and the wrong comb shapes and the wrong everything, and the cool incubators had only finished what the market had already started. She lit the brooder lamps her grandfather had left hanging from the rafters. She filled the long wooden troughs with warm water and crushed grain. She sat on an overturned bucket in the middle of that building until well after dark and watched 1,000 chicks slowly remember that they were alive. Opal came up the ridge the next morning carrying a tin of biscuits and a covered pot of coffee, the way she came up every Tuesday, and she stood in the doorway of the long, low building and looked at the chicks for almost as long as Willa had looked at them at the barn. Opal was a small woman, narrow as her granddaughter, built of the same patient bone. She wore the same brown coveralls she had worn for 40 years without self-consciousness because she had earned the right. She did not ask Willa what she had been thinking, did not ask how much they had cost. She walked the length of the building once, slowly, stopping at each brooder lamp and looking up at the rafters, then came back to the doorway. Your grandfather built this house for these. Willa looked at her. Opal pointed up at the eaves, where Silas had set the vents at a particular height, then at the wooden floor he had laid on cedar sleepers 2 feet off the ground, then at the southern wall he had hung with shutters that could be raised and lowered by a single rope. He was particular, she said. He read books nobody else read. What kind of books? The kind that said the breeds people were giving up on were the ones that would matter again. Opal looked at the chicks one more time. Those are the ones. She set the biscuits on the workbench and walked back down the ridge to her own kitchen and did not come back up for 3 days, which was the longest she had ever gone without checking on Willa since March. Willa understood without being told that her grandmother was giving her room. She spent those 3 days the way a person spends days when something living has been put into their hands. She kept the brooder lamps at the right height by climbing a stepladder twice a day and adjusting the chains. She mixed the feed by hand, adding crumbled hard-boiled egg the first week each, the way an old husbandry pamphlet from 1869 she found in a kitchen drawer said to do. The building held heat better than she had expected, the floor on its cedar sleepers keeping the cold of the ground from rising, the vents drawing the damp air up and out in the way Silas had intended. Then the second week arrived, and with it the first hard test. She woke at 4 in the morning to a silence that was wrong. Not the silence of sleeping birds, something flatter than that, something with an absence in it. She dressed in the dark and took the lantern from the hook by the door and walked across the yard. The brooder lamp in the eastern corner had gone out. Not from lack of oil, the chain had frayed through at a single corroded link, and the lamp had dropped and extinguished itself against the floor, and the corner of the building had been without heat for hours. She counted, then counted again, because she did not want to believe the number. 89 chicks. She carried them out behind the building in the dark and buried them in a row at the edge of the woods, because she could not bring herself to do otherwise. It took nearly 2 hours. The sky had not yet grayed when she walked back inside. She sat on the overturned bucket and did not move for an hour. Did not cry. Crying had not yet found its way to her. She sat with the number and let it be what it was. Then she climbed the stepladder and examined every remaining chain in the building. All of them. She took down 3 more that showed wear at the links and replaced them with new rope from the coil in the workshop. When she was finished, she climbed down and stood in the middle of the building and looked up at every lamp in turn until she was satisfied. She opened the green cloth-bound notebook she had brought from the house and wrote, 89. Chain failure, eastern corner. Feed weakness from hatchery compounded cold exposure. Will not happen again. Then she drew a line under those last 4 words and drew it twice. By the end of 10 days, she had lost 127 chicks, altogether less than she had braced for in her worst accounting, more than she wanted to remember. She carried each one out and buried it in the same row at the edge of the woods, because holding that line was the only way she knew to hold the other lines. She did not name them. She held that line almost completely. There was a small rust-colored pullet with a crooked toe that followed her along the inside of the wire whenever she walked past, and that one she called Pin, short for nothing, meaning nothing she could have explained, and she said the name only to herself and never wrote it down. By the end of the 3rd week, the brooder lamps were off during the day. By the end of the 5th week, the chicks had moved out into the fenced run that ran the length of the south wall. By the end of the 7th week, they were birds, not chicks' feathers coming in mottled and rust and dun and slate, and they were the strangest-looking flock Calhoun County had seen in a generation. Every one of the 873 survivors was alive. Word got around the way word gets around. Taj Munro mentioned to his mother that the Breck girl had not lost the chicks like everybody said she would. His mother mentioned it at the dry goods counter. From there it traveled to the Crossroads store where Hetty Moss ran the register and knew everything about everybody within a 12-mile radius. Hetty told Court Dillard when he came in for his Wednesday coffee and Court snorted and said alive wasn't the same as worth anything. You wait. He was not wrong in a narrow sense. The birds were alive, but they were not yet anything else. They were not laying. They were not big enough to butcher. There were 873 mouths that needed feeding twice a day, and feed cost money, and the small inheritance was a smaller inheritance every week. Willa sat at her grandfather's kitchen table on Sunday nights with the green notebook open in front of her and wrote down every dollar that went out and every dollar that did not come in. She watched the column on the left grow and the column on the right stay blank, and she did not panic, because panicking was not a thing her family had ever found useful. Instead, she went looking. She went up into the attic of the big house, which she had not yet had the heart to sort through, and spent 4 cold evenings in October going through the wooden trunks Silas had left. She was looking for the books Opal had mentioned. She found them in the 3rd trunk, beneath a folded wool blanket that smelled of cedar, a dozen of them, slim and cloth-bound, with titles like Standard of Perfection and The Dual-Purpose Fowl, and one in particular, hand-stitched and clearly older than the rest, that had no title on the cover at all, but had Silas Breck written inside the front board in pencil in his careful slanting hand. It was a notebook, 23 years of a notebook. He had begun it in 1861 and written in it in fits and starts until the year he died, and it was a record of every breeding pair he had ever kept, every cross he had ever attempted, every observation he had ever thought worth setting down, every flock lost to cold or disease, named and numbered and mourned in half a sentence, every successful laying season tallied in the margins with the kind of quiet satisfaction a man puts into figures when figures are the only poetry available to him. But it was also an argument. Her grandfather had been arguing quietly, only with himself, in the page that the country was going to need these birds again. He wrote about pests. He wrote about how the broiler operations spreading through the valleys sprayed their grounds with compounds that killed everything that walked or crawled, and how the heritage flocks his own father had kept had done that work for free, eating the ticks and the beetles and the grasshoppers down to nothing. The day was coming, he wrote in 1871, and again in 1879, and again in 1882, when the insects would come back stronger than the poisons, and the people with the right kind of birds would be the only ones still standing. He had underlined right kind of birds. On the next page he had drawn, in careful pencil, a small sketch of a rust-colored hen with a particular comb shape and a particular leg coloring, and beneath it he had written, "This is what they look like." Willa sat at the table with the notebook open and looked at that sketch for a long time. Then she rose, walked out across the dark yard with the lantern, and shone the light through the wire of the long, low building. She stood there without moving, because the birds in her grandfather's flock her flock now, and the birds in her grandfather's sketch were, allowing for the natural variation of any heritage line, the same bird. She had not planned for this. She had not gone to that auction looking for a continuation of anything. She had crouched down in the back of the Calhoun County barn and seen something nobody else had seen, and she had paid $40, and she had driven home, and here was what she had driven home with, the living conclusion of 23 years of argument that had never once been answered. She did not tell anyone what she had found, not even Opal, not yet. She went on as she had been going on, feeding twice a day, mucking the building once a week, watching the birds grow into themselves, and she carried the knowledge of the sketch the way a person carries something fragile, lightly, with both hands, without announcing it. In December, the first pullet laid an egg. It was small, brown, with a freckled shell and a weight to it that felt disproportionate for something that size. Willa found it in the corner of the run in the early morning, the frost still hard on the ground, and she held it in her palm for a full minute before put it in her coat pocket and carried it down the ridge to her grandmother's kitchen. Opal looked at the egg on the table between them. "Early," she said. "I know." Opal picked the egg up and turned it once in her hand and set it in a small bowl on the windowsill, and she did not eat it. A week later, when Willa came down on Tuesday with the biscuit tin to return, the egg was still there. It sat in that bowl on the windowsill for the next 4 years, and no one moved it, and no one needed to explain why. By February, the pullets were laying steadily 2 and 3 dozen a day and climbing. Willa built 3 small wooden boxes lined with straw, began setting eggs out on a folding table at the end of the drive with a coffee tin and a hand-lettered sign, 0.25 a dozen. Eggs from heritage hens. Exact change appreciated. The first week she sold 4 dozen, all of them to people who already knew her grandmother. The second week she sold 11. By the end of March she was selling 60 dozen a week and had to set out a second table. And Hetty Moss at the Crossroads store had begun telling anyone who came in asking about good eggs to drive on up to the Breck place on Slateback Hollow Road, because that girl had something different. One Saturday in April, a woman came up the ridge in a light buckboard and a good wool coat and bought every egg Willa had on the table, then asked if she could come back the following Saturday and buy that many again. She was a cook for a dining establishment in Charleston, she explained, and she had broken one of the eggs into a pan that morning, and the yolk had stood up like a small orange dome, and she had not seen a yolk do that in a restaurant kitchen in 12 years. Willa said she could come back. The woman came back. She brought another cook the next time, And the time after that, she brought a man who made detailed sketches of the long, low building, the mottled birds in the run, the freckled eggs arranged in their wooden boxes. The sketches appeared in an agricultural publication Willa had never heard of, and after that the wagons coming up Slateback Hollow Road on Saturdays were no longer only the wagons of people Opal knew. Court Diller drove past the end of the drive one Saturday in May and saw 7 wagons parked along the gravel and a line of people at the folding table. He slowed his horse nearly to a stop. Then he clicked his tongue and moved on and did not mention it at the feed store on Monday, though 3 other men did. The conversation around the coffee pot that morning was the first conversation about Willa Breck at the feed store that did not contain the word funeral. She spent 4 evenings in October going back to the trunks in the attic, not because she had forgotten anything in Silas's notebook, but because she wanted to understand the margins, the footnotes, the small notations he had made in the years after the main entries, when his handwriting had grown slower and the sentences shorter. There was a passage from 1877, written in the particular way of a man who believes he is writing something no one will read in his lifetime. The insects will outlast the chemicals. Every farmer in this county knows it and will not say so. The breeds that forage, the ones that scratch and range and work the ground, those are the breeds that will answer what the chemicals cannot. I have tried to say this. No one listens to a man talking about chickens. Willa read that passage 3 times. Then she turned to the very last entry, dated 2 years before Silas died, written in a hand that had grown careful in the way of age, each letter set down with deliberate intention. It said, built the long house for them. Vents at 32 inches, floor on cedar, south shutters on a single rope. If someone comes after me who knows what to look for, they will understand why. If no one comes, the building will stand anyway, and that will have to be enough. She closed the notebook and sat with her hands flat on the cover for a long time. He had built that building not for the birds he was keeping, but for the birds someone after him might keep. He had designed it for a future he was not certain would arrive. He had set the vents at 32 inches and laid the floor on cedar sleepers and hung the south shutters on a single rope, and then he had waited, and then he had died. And the building had stood empty for 12 years, until his granddaughter drove home from an auction with 1,000 chicks nobody wanted. She did not feel chosen. She did not feel destined. She felt the particular weight of being understood by someone who had not known her, of being anticipated, carefully, across a distance of years, by a man who had built a room she fit into without knowing she would. She put the notebook back in the trunk and went downstairs and did not sleep until nearly morning. By the 7th week, the birds were ranging in the fenced run from first light until dark, and the run itself was beginning to show the effects of 873 birds working the same ground. Willa extended the fence along the south wall, giving them access to a narrow strip of the orchard that had not produced a useful crop of anything in 6 years. The birds moved into the new ground immediately, scratching through the leaf litter, working the beats of each tree with the focused efficiency of creatures doing what they were shaped to do. Within a week, the ground beneath the trees was turned and aerated in a way no amount of human effort could have produced at the same pace. She noted it in the green notebook without attaching significance to it. It was simply what she saw. The winter settled in hard that year, the ridges above the hollow holding snow through February. And Willa kept the brooder lamps burning at night from November through March, climbing the stepladder in the cold to check every chain before she went to bed, every single night, because she had drawn that line under those 4 words and she intended to keep it. The birds were hardier than she had expected, the heritage lines better insulated against cold than the commercial breeds, the mixed genetics of the flock producing a resilience that no individual strain might have managed alone. She lost 3 birds to illness over the winter, 3, where she had feared 40. She wrote the number down the way her grandfather had written his numbers, plainly, without ceremony, because numbers told the truth when you let them. Spring came late, the way spring always comes late to the ridges of Calhoun County, arriving not in a single day but in the slow, incremental way of water finding its level a few degrees warmer each week, the ice going out of the creek, the mud season giving way reluctantly to something firmer underfoot. By April, the pullets were laying 60 dozen a week. By May, the number had climbed past 80. The second folding table at the end of the drive could not hold it all, and Willa began setting surplus eggs aside in the cool of the workshop, sorted by date, turning them every other day. She sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday night in late May and opened the green notebook to the columns. The left column, every dollar out, ran for 3 full pages now. The right column had been blank since October. She picked up the pencil. She wrote the first number in the right column, the $4 from the first Saturday of egg sales in February, then the next week's number, then the next. She worked backward through the months, filling in what she had recorded elsewhere and not yet transferred. When she was finished, she set the pencil down and looked at both columns together. The right column was shorter than the left. Still shorter, still catching up, but it was no longer blank, and it was growing faster than the left column was growing, and in the arithmetic of a working farm, that gap was the only thing that mattered. She hired Taj Munro in September. He had turned 18 in August and had been looking for a way out of his father's house, and he had asked her, simply and directly, One morning when he brought a message up from Hetty Moss at the crossroads, whether she had work. She told him she did. She told him she would pay him 14 cents an hour, which was 2 cents more than the feed store paid, and 4 cents more than the auction barn paid, and that she expected him to show up on time and work at full attention and not require her to repeat herself. He said he could do that. He could. She watched him that first week and noticed the things she would write in the notebook that son TM watches the birds before moving them. Does not assume. The flock responds differently to him than to me, which is not a problem. It is information. She had not expected to like having someone else in the building. She had spent months alone with the birds, and the aloneness had become comfortable, the particular piece of a person who has learned the rhythms of a place so well that the place has begun to feel like an extension of the self. But Taji moved through the building with a quiet that matched hers without copying it, and the birds registered his presence as neutral, which was the best you could ask of someone new. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He asked the right ones at the right moments and then listened to the full answer before speaking again, which was rarer than it should have been in a boy of 18. December came again. A year since the first egg. The pullets were laying through the shortening days at a rate that surprised her. The heritage breeds more persistent in their laying than the commercial catalogs had ever suggested. The longer light of the south-facing run and the thermal mass of the cedar-floored building combining to extend the season past what anyone who had not read Silas Breck's notebook would have thought possible. She sold 80 dozen eggs on the second Saturday of December, in temperatures that kept most people off the ridge roads, to 18 different buyers who had driven up regardless. One of them, a man from over in Gilmer County who had heard about the flock from Percival Stout at a stockman's meeting, stood at the table and held a single egg up against the gray winter sky, turning it slowly. "These are freckled," he said, with the tone of a man who has just noticed something he should have noticed sooner. Heritage hens lay freckled shells. The pigment deposits differently. He bought 4 dozen and came back the following Saturday with his wife. She wrote his name in the notebook, not in the customer column exactly, but in a section she had begun keeping in the back, tracking the shape the demand was taking. Who bought eggs and who bought them repeatedly? Who mentioned the yolk color and who mentioned the shell? Which questions people asked and which questions they did not think to ask but answered anyway in the way they handled the eggs before they put them in their baskets. She was learning something, though she could not yet have said precisely what. It had to do with what the eggs were and what people understood about what the eggs were and the gap between those two things. Opal came up the ridge on a Tuesday afternoon in late December, not her usual morning visit but an afternoon one, which was unusual enough that Willa set down the feed scoop and watched her come up the path. Opal went straight to the long, low building and stood in the doorway in the winter light, looking at the flock. The birds were inside now, the cold keeping them off the run, and the building was warm and close and full of the particular low sound 873 birds make when they are contentedly occupied. She walked the full length of the building and back, and she stopped at the workbench where the green notebook sat open to the week's feed tallies. "He kept one of these," she said. Willa said she knew. "He kept one for 23 years and nobody read it while he was alive. He would read from it sometimes, at supper, and your grandfather was not a man people thought of as a reader of things, so they did not always listen the way they should have." She paused. "I did not always listen the way I should have." It was the most Opal had said at once since Willa had come back to the hollow, and she said it the way old women say the true things plainly, without asking for response, setting it down between them like an object that would stay where it was placed. Willa thought of the passage from 1877. "I have tried to say this. No one listens to a man talking about chickens." She did not say this out loud. Opal turned and looked at her granddaughter with the steady, assessing look she had used all Willa's life, the look that had never once been confused with anything as simple as approval or disapproval. It was the look of a woman who had been watching for a very long time and had learned exactly what watching was for. "The first egg was in December," Opal said. "Yes, and it's December again, yes. Then you've made it through a year." She said it without flourish, without the warmth some grandmothers would have wrapped around such a sentence. She said it the way her husband had written his numbers, plainly, because plainness was the only way to say a true thing without breaking it. Willa looked at her grandmother in the doorway of the building Silas had built for these birds before either of them was born. In the last light of a December afternoon, with 873 birds moving quietly behind her in the warmth Silas had designed into the walls and the floor and the rafters. She felt the weight on her shoulders clearly, the full measure of it, the cost of the feed and the cost of the chains and the cost of the 89 she had not saved and the 127 she had counted and carried out in the dark. But the weight had changed. It had taken on, over the course of 12 months, the texture of something that fit the way a tool fits after long use, conforming over time to the shape of the hand that holds it. She did not say any of this. "Through a year," she said instead. Opal nodded once, picked up the biscuit tin she had set on the workbench, and walked back down the ridge in the last of the afternoon light, her footsteps steady and unhurried on the frozen ground. Willa stood in the doorway until her grandmother was out of sight. Then she turned back to the building, to the warmth and the sound, to the 873 birds that had been 1,000 chicks nobody wanted at the back of the Calhoun County livestock barn on a cold October morning, and she picked up the feed scoop and went back to work. The second year began with mud. Came in late February, the way it always came to the ridges of Calhoun County, not gradually but all at once, as though the ground had been holding something back all winter and had finally grown tired of the effort. The creek at the bottom of the hollow rose 2 feet in 3 days, and the switchbacks leading up to the ridge turned to a soft, rutted paste that swallowed wagon wheels to the hub and made the morning feeding run a 40-minute negotiation instead of a 15-minute walk. Willa put cedar planks down along the worst stretch of the path between the house and the long, low building, the same cedar smell rising from the cut ends that rose from the floor her grandfather had laid, and she thought without sentiment that Silas Breck had understood mud the way he had understood everything else about this place, not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be planned around. The birds did not care about the mud. They cared about the ground thawing beneath it, and the insects the thaw brought up, and they worked the exposed earth along the fence line with a focused industry that left long, bare strips of overturned soil running the length of the run by the first week of March. Willa watched them from the doorway of the building on a morning, when the temperature had finally climbed above freezing and stayed there, and she thought of the passage in Silas's notebook about the grasshoppers, and the compounds, and the day coming when the right kind of birds would be the only answer left. That day had not arrived yet, but the mud was thawing, and the birds were working, and the right kind of birds were hers. She sold 91 dozen eggs on the first Saturday of March, in weather that was still cold enough for her breath to show, to 23 buyers who had driven up the hollow on roads that were barely passable. One of them had come from as far as Sutton, 20 miles east, because a woman at his church had described the yolks. He bought 6 dozen and stood at the table for a moment after paying and looked out across the sloped fence line where the birds were already ranging in the thin morning light. "How many have you got?" 873. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a person revising their estimate of a situation. "All from that one lot? All from that one lot." He did not say anything else, but he came back the following Saturday and bought 6 dozen again, and the Saturday after that, and by April he had become one of the regular buyers whose name she had written in the back of the notebook, under a heading that said, simply, returns. The list of returns was growing faster than the list of first-timers, which was the pattern she had been watching for without knowing she was watching for it. People who bought the eggs once came back. That was not a coincidence. That was a product. She raised the price to 30 cents a dozen in April, with a hand-lettered amendment to the sign that she posted on a Tuesday and left for buyers to find on Saturday without announcement or explanation. Every dozen sold that first Saturday at 30 cents. Every dozen sold the Saturday after. No one mentioned the price change to her directly, which she understood to mean they had noticed it and decided it was acceptable, which was its own kind of answer. She wrote $30 in the notebook next to the date and did not underline it, because it was a number, and numbers told the truth without decoration. Rufus Ewan came up the hollow for the first time in April, on a Tuesday morning when Willa was mending the east fence line where the ground heave had worked 2 posts loose over the winter. He was 64 years old, a careful man with a slow way of speaking that people who did not know him sometimes mistook for uncertainty. He came on horseback and tied the horse at the fence post she was resetting and stood with his arms folded and watched her work for a moment before he spoke. He had heard about the eggs, heard about the birds, heard that she had lost some chicks in the first winter and replaced the chains herself and not lost any more. He had a problem 60 acres of hay ground that was producing poorly because the grasshopper pressure had been worsening for 3 seasons. The county extension man had told him to spray. He had sprayed. The grasshoppers had come back the following year as thick as before and his second cutting had been short. He wanted to know if her birds could do anything about it. Willa set the post back in the hole and tamped the earth around it before she answered. She said she thought they could. She said she could bring 100 birds down to his place for 2 weeks to start, at no charge, just to see because she had watched them work the orchard strip and the fence line and the extended run, and the ground they left behind was different from the ground they had started with, and different in the right direction. Rufus looked at her with the measuring look of a man who has been farming long enough to be suspicious of solutions that do not cost anything. "What do you want out of it?" "If it works," she said, "I want you to tell people it worked." He thought about that. "I can do that." She brought the 100 birds down the following week in wooden crates loaded into the wagon bed, and she and Tadji set up a portable fence of wooden stakes and wire around a half-acre of the worst hay ground on the Ewan place. The birds went into the enclosure and immediately began doing what they did, fanning out and working the ground in the overlapping, systematic way that still struck Willa as purposeful beyond anything she had trained into them, because she had trained nothing into them. This was what the breeds were. This was what the lines her grandfather had preserved across 23 years of careful record-keeping had been built to do. She moved the fence every 2 days, giving the birds fresh ground. She came back every morning to check the water and count the birds, because the wooden stake fence was less secure than the permanent wire back at the hollow, and she had learned what a single night of inattention could cost. It was on the fifth morning that it cost her anyway. She arrived at the Ewan place at first light to find the south corner of the fence pulled partway from the ground. Something had worked at it in the night, patient and low to the earth, and 23 birds were dead inside the enclosure, killed quickly and left. 17 more were gone into the surrounding woods. She stood at the fence corner and looked at the damage. The morning was cold and very quiet. Tadji stood beside her and did not speak. She counted what remained, verified the number, then walked to the farmhouse and knocked on Rufus Ewan's door. He opened it in his work clothes, already up. She told him what had happened before he could ask, no softening of it, no prelude. Then she reached into her coat pocket and placed the full week's payment she had planned to charge him on the table just inside the door. Rufus looked at the money. "You haven't charged me anything yet. I'm telling you what I would have charged you and what it would have been worth, and I'm telling you this replaces it." Her voice was even because she had made the decision before she knocked on the door, and decisions made clearly did not require emotion at the moment of their delivery. "I'll replace the lost birds at my own cost and finish the 2 weeks with a reinforced fence. No additional charge." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite categorize, not pity, not sympathy, something more like recognition. "Nobody's done that with me before. It's fair. I could argue it's more than fair. Then we disagree on what fair means. Do you want me to finish the job or not?" He said he did. She bought heavier gauge wire in Grantsville that afternoon, paid for it from the savings she had been accumulating toward a second roll of standard fence, and came back the next morning to rebuild the enclosure. She drove the stakes deeper and doubled the wire at ground level and ran a second stake line 18 inches outside the first. It cost her 3 weeks of forward progress she had been tracking in the notebook. She wrote the number down and did not draw a line under it. Rufus Ewan told the story at the feed store the following Monday. Not the story of the lost birds, the story of the money placed on his table at first light and the fence rebuilt the next day. He told it in the slow, careful way of a man who is reporting something he witnessed and has decided was true, and the men around the coffee pot listened the way they listened to Rufus Ewan, which was fully because he had not overstated a thing in 40 years of farming, and everyone in the room knew it. By the end of that week, 2 men had sent messages up the hollow asking if Willa could bring birds to their ground. She finished the 2 weeks on the Ewan place on a morning in late May when the light came in low and gold across the hayfield and the half-acre the birds had worked looked, from a distance, almost vibrant. The soil turned and enriched in the way of ground that has been managed correctly, the remaining grasshopper population, a fraction of what it had been when she arrived. Rufus walked the perimeter of the worked area with her before she loaded the birds, his hands clasped behind him, not speaking until he had seen everything he wanted to see. "The pressure's down. You can see it in the ground." He paused at the corner where the fence had been pulled. The stakes were solid. The doubled wire had not moved. "The hay that comes in on this piece will be the best I've cut in 3 years." Willa began disassembling the fence section by section, passing the stakes to Tadji to load. "What are you charging the others?" Rufus asked. She told him she had not yet decided. He was quiet for a moment, watching her work. "Don't undercharge," he said at last. "Free work makes people think the work is worth what they paid." She stopped with a fence stake in both hands and looked at him. $2 a week per 100 birds. That's what the work is worth. Maybe more, but start there and don't move off it. She held on to that number on the drive back up the hollow. Rufus Ewan had given her something more durable than advice, the framework for what the work actually was. Not a favor, not an experiment, not a curiosity from a girl on a ridge with a strange flock, but a service with a fair price, one that said something about the service by costing something appropriate to it. She wrote 2.0 week 100 birds in the notebook that evening and did not cross-reference it or hedge it with conditions. It was the price, would stay the price. By June she had birds working 3 properties simultaneously: the Ewan place on rotation, Percival Stout's corn ground along the river bottom, and a hay farm belonging to a man named Aldous Wren, who had heard about the Ewan job from his wife's cousin at a Methodist social in Grantsville. Tadji moved between the sites with her, managing the fence relocations while she handled the customer conversations and the logistics of which birds went where and for how long. The notebook had developed a second section by this point, not the 2-column ledger she had been keeping since the beginning, but a kind of map. Which properties had what kind of pest pressure, which directions the grasshoppers moved when disturbed, which soil types the birds preferred to work. She had not set out to gather this information. She had gathered it the way her grandfather had gathered everything, which was by paying attention to what was in front of her and writing it down without prejudging what it meant. She bought the second roll of fence wire in late June. Then she ordered a small galvanic battery device through a hardware catalog out of Cincinnati, the kind used to run a light electric current along a fence line, deterring predators without requiring the doubled gauge installation she had built on the Ewan repair. She waited 4 weeks for it to arrive, spent an afternoon with Tadji getting it working, and the first night she tested it on the Stout property she walked the perimeter at midnight and found 3 sets of tracks stopping 2 feet short of the wire and turning back. She wrote that down too. The summer deepened into a heat that pressed down on the ridges and held there through July, and into August the creeks running lower than usual, the hay fields going brown earlier than anyone wanted. The grasshopper pressure that had been concerning for 3 seasons became something that warranted a different word, and the county extension man started using infestation in the pages of the Grantsville weekly paper. The birds on the stout property alone could not address 200 acres of corn ground. Willa was not offering to solve the county's problem. She was offering to solve the corner of the problem that her birds could reach, and the corner they could reach was the corner she had contracted for. And she held to that limit precisely because exceeding it would have meant promising more than she could deliver. But the inquiries kept coming, messages left with Hetty Moss at the Crossroads store, because that was how communication traveled in the hollow. Willa responded to each inquiry in order, quoted the price without apology or negotiation, and scheduled the jobs in the sequence she could actually fill them. She turned away no one. She simply told some of them they would have to wait until September. Taj, who noticed first. They were moving the fence on the Wren property on a Wednesday afternoon in late July, the heat sitting heavy, and the birds working in the shade of the fence line. When Taj straightened up from driving a stake and looked out across the adjacent field unharvested, the hay standing brown and thick, and above it the kind of movement that made a person stop. There, he said. The grasshoppers in the field next to the fence section were moving in the concentrated directional way of a population under pressure from the side that was toward her birds. The flock was pushing them without pursuing them, simply by working the ground up to the fence line. They were creating a pressure zone that was shifting the insect population across the adjacent boundary. They're moving the problem sideways, Taj said. Not as a complaint, but as an observation he was not sure whether to bring to her. They're doing their job. The problem moving sideways is the problem getting smaller. It doesn't go away in a day. It goes away in a season if you work it right. He turned a fence stake in his hands. Does Wren know the effect extends past his fence line? It was a better question than she had expected from him, which was not a low bar. He knows his ground is being treated. He doesn't need to understand the mechanism. But you're right that the neighbor's field is benefiting at no cost, and the neighbor hasn't asked. She filed that away, the kind of thing that would matter later, when the operation was larger and the relationships between properties more complicated. She wrote lateral pressure effect observe across seasons in the notebook that evening, with Taji's initials beside it, because it had been his observation and that deserved acknowledgement. September arrived and the morning temperatures fell back below the line that made the ridge feel like itself again. The extended grazing season had worked the orchard ground thoroughly enough that Willa spent an afternoon in early September moving the flock through the strip of open ground that ran along the north side of the collapsed tobacco barn. The birds spread across it with the same focused attention they brought to every new ground. She was watching them work when she heard a horse on the gravel at the bottom of the drive. She knew before she turned. Not from the particular sound of the horse, she did not know his horse well enough for that, but from some quality in the pace of it, the unhurried deliberateness of an animal whose rider had had to work himself up to the trip and did not want to arrive before he was ready. Court Dillard tied his horse at the fence post and came across the yard with his hat in his hand. He had not carried his hat in his hand at the auction barn. At the auction barn, his hat had been on his head, and his thumbs had been in his belt loops, and he had been a man delivering a verdict. He crossed her yard now the way a man crosses ground he is not sure of. Not uncertain of the footing, but uncertain of the reception. He stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked up at her. I came to ask about your birds. She set down the feed measure she had been carrying. All right. He told her about the hay fields, 80 acres, the second cutting lost, the spray not working. He said it plainly, without prelude, which cost him something she could see in the set of his jaw. Then he was quiet for a moment, working through something, sorting the versions of the sentence he had come to say, until he found the one he could deliver. I was wrong about those chicks. The words came out level and direct. He looked at her as he said them, which was harder than not looking, and he knew it. She let the sentence exist between them for the length of time it had earned. The morning was cool and still. The birds were working the north strip and making the sounds they made when the ground was good. How many acres, she asked. 80. I can put 400 birds on your ground starting Monday. $2 a week per 100, 6 weeks to clear it if the weather holds. Total of $48 for the run. That's fair. I know it's fair. He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost a fraction of a shift at the corner of his mouth that registered, and then resolved back into the weathered stillness of his usual face. He set his hat back on his head. I appreciate it, Miss Breck. He walked back to his horse and rode down the ridge without looking back, and Willa stood on the porch and watched him go. She did not feel triumphant. Triumph would have required her to have been thinking about him, and she had mostly been thinking about fence tension and lateral pressure effects and the movement of a grasshopper population through dry hay in late summer. What she felt was something quieter and more structural, the sense of a thing settling into its right place, which was different from winning because it did not require anyone else to lose. She went back to the workbench, opened the green notebook, and wrote his name in the right-hand column. The right-hand column was longer than the left-hand column now. It had been longer for 2 months. She looked at both columns together for a moment. The way you look at a thing you have been building when you finally step back far enough to see it whole, then closed the notebook and went to move the fence. The Dillard job ran the 6 weeks she had said it would. 400 birds on rotating portable fence across 80 acres of hay ground, moved every 2 days, the galvanic charger doing its work through 3 weeks of good weather and 1 week of rain that softened the ground and made the moving harder, but also drove more insects to the surface and gave the birds a concentrated opportunity they used without instruction. The third cutting came in thin, but it came in. Court Dillard paid in full on the last Friday, counting the bills at the gate with the methodical attention of a man who has always managed his own money and does not make a ceremony of parting with it. He stood for a while after paying and watched the birds working the last section. Your grandfather built the wrong kind of house on purpose, he said. Not a question. He built the right kind. Dillard was quiet for a moment. That's what I meant. He picked up his hat from the fence post where he had set it. I'll be in touch about the spring run. She drove back up the hollow that evening with the money in her coat pocket and the notebook open on the wagon seat beside her, and she wrote his name again in the right-hand column next to the spring run notation, because she had learned from Silas Breck's 23 years of record-keeping that the right column was never really finished. She hired Owen Munro in October. He was Tedgy's cousin, 20 years old, had been helping at a livery stable in Grantsville since he turned 17 and had run out of things to learn there. Tadgy had mentioned him in passing one afternoon in August, briefly once, without advocacy the way Tadgy mentioned things he thought were true and wanted to let stand on their own. In September, Willa had watched Owen help Tadgy move a fence section on the Stout property, and the movement that followed had been efficient in a specific way she recognized from Silas Breck's notebook. The birds had adjusted to him within 20 minutes. Most people took 2 full days. She offered him the work at the same rate as Tadgy. He came without asking a single question about the method, which told her he had already learned it from watching, which was the right way to learn anything. By November, she had 3 people working the flock in addition to herself, and the flock had expanded to 1,100 birds. She had purchased a second small lot of heritage chicks in July, a different mix from the original lot but compatible, and had raised them through the fall in the extended run while the main flock was on rotation. The integration had taken 3 weeks and had required more fence adjustment than she had anticipated, but by October the 2 cohorts were moving together as a single unit, which was what she had been watching for. She built the second long, low building in October and November. She had been thinking about it since August, when it had become clear that 1,100 birds in a building designed for 900 was a stress she would have to address before winter. Collapsed tobacco barn provided the footprint. The stone foundation was sound, the earth inside it level and dry, which was the hardest thing to start with. She sourced the lumber from a barn being taken down over in Gilmer County, chestnut planking that matched the original building in grain and density, and she had Tadgy and Owen help her with the framing on 3 dry Saturdays in late October. She built it to Silas's specification, vents at 32 inches, floor on cedar sleepers, south wall shutters on a single rope. She did these things not from sentiment but from the evidence of 12 months watching the original building do its work, and the evidence was sufficient. Blythe Vane built the nest boxes. Blythe had come to Willa in September, not with a letter or a formal approach, but simply by walking up the hollow one morning and saying that the sewing factory in Grantsville had closed and she had heard there might be work on the ridge. She was 31, had been working in the factory since she was 19, and had hands that moved with the particular economy of someone accustomed to repetitive precision work. Willa had shown her the nest box design from Silas's notebook, the proportions, the angle of the entry lip, the way the interior was baffled to give the hens privacy without sacrificing ventilation, and Blythe had looked at it for 2 minutes and gone to the workshop and started cutting wood. The nest boxes she produced were better than the ones in the original building. The joinery was cleaner, and the entry lips were angled at a more consistent degree, which the hens preferred in a way that showed immediately in the rate at which they used them versus the floor corners. Willa noted this, without saying anything to Blythe about the comparison, because the comparison was not relevant information. What mattered was the boxes worked and the person who had made them could make more. She paid Blythe the same rate as Tadgy and Owen. When Blythe came to her at the end of the first week and said she expected the work was seasonal and wanted to know how to plan for the winter, Willa told her it was not seasonal and she should plan for it the same way she planned for everything else, which was to say by accounting for it honestly and not assuming it would solve itself. Blythe looked at her for a moment. "You're not like other employers I've had." "I haven't had employers," Willa said, "so I have to work from the notebook." Blythe did not know what the notebook was. It did not matter. The wages were real, and the work was real, and the building going up between the original long house and the fallen tobacco barn foundation was real, and those things mattered more than an explanation of where they came from. The second building was finished on a Friday evening in November, the last of the chestnut planking nailed in place by lamplight, because the light had gone earlier than they had planned for. Willa and Tadgy and Owen and Blythe stood in the new building for a moment, in the warm smell of fresh-cut wood, the brooder lamps not yet lit, the space still empty and clean and unused. Willa looked at the vents at 32 inches, at the floor on its cedar sleepers, At the rope running down the south wall to the shutter hardware, coiled at the bottom, cleat the way the drawing in Silas's notebook showed it, though the notebook had not specified the coiling, and she had simply done it the way that made sense. Tadgy and Owen carried the first birds in from the original building that same evening, 100 at a time in the wooden crates, 4 trips each, Blythe holding the lamp at the doorway while they transferred the birds into the fresh-laid nesting boxes. The birds settled quickly, which they did when the conditions were right. When the conditions were right, they simply stopped fighting the space and became part of it. Willa walked home up the path between the two buildings, the old one with its 12 years of use worked into the wood, the new one still bright and smelling of the mill, and stopped between them in the cold and stood still for a moment. She had not intended to build a second building when she drove home from the auction with 1,000 sick chicks in the wagon bed 14 months ago. She had not intended any of this. What she had done was look at 1,000 chicks nobody wanted and see that they were not dying, only cold and hungry and misread, and she had paid $40. And then she had done the next thing that needed doing, and then the next thing after that. And here was what a year and 2 months of next things had produced. 2 long, low buildings on the ridge her grandfather had built for one of them, 4 people doing work they were suited to. 1,100 birds that were the living conclusion of 23 years of argument, written in a notebook no one had read until she found it in a trunk under a wool blanket that smelled of cedar. Opal came up the ridge the next morning with the biscuit tin. She stood in the doorway of the new building for a long time without entering. The birds were moving in the fresh space with the exploratory attention of creatures in unfamiliar ground, working the perimeter, testing the nesting boxes, settling into the corners where the heat from the lamps collected. Opal watched them in the way she watched everything, with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who has spent 81 years learning that the right way to see something is to look at it long enough for it to stop performing and simply be. Then she looked at the floor, at the vents, at the south wall shutters on their single rope. He would have liked to see it, she said. Willa thought of the last entry in the notebook. If someone comes after me who knows what to look for, they will understand why. I think he is seeing it. Opal did not answer that. She reached across the space between them and placed her hand over Willa's hand on the doorframe, and they stood that way for a while in the warmth and the bird noise and the smell of cedar and new-cut chestnut, until the cold at their backs made remaining still impractical, and they went inside to start the day. Winter settled into the hollow the way it always did, not in a single hard freeze, but in a series of incremental surrenders, each warmer day giving back a little more ground than the last, until one morning Willa woke to a silence that meant the creek had iced over and the season had fully arrived. The second building held heat well. There was a difference between expecting a thing and standing in the evidence of it at 5 in the morning, while the temperature outside was 8 degrees, and the birds inside were moving with the calm, settled industry of creatures whose basic needs were being met. She had not lost a bird to cold that winter, not one. She wrote the number in the notebook 0 plainly, with the date beside it, and understood that the 0 was the result of the change she had checked every night for 14 months. And the cedar sleepers, and the vents at 32 inches, and the doubled wire on the fence, and the 127 birds she had carried out of the original building in the dark during the first winter, and buried in a row at the edge of the woods. The 0 was built from those things. It did not arrive on its own. February brought a letter from the Agricultural College in Morgantown. It came addressed to her in a formal hand, the envelope bearing the college seal in the upper corner, and it sat on the kitchen table for an hour before she opened it, because she had learned, growing up in a house where letters rarely contained good news, to let a letter exist as a letter before she let it become its contents. The letter was from a professor of animal husbandry who had read the piece in the agricultural publication, the one with the sketches of the building and the birds and the freckled eggs, and who wanted to know if she would be willing to correspond about her breeding records. He wrote in the careful, slightly formal language of an educated man writing to someone whose education he was uncertain of, and he was respectful without being condescending, which was a balance she had encountered rarely enough that she noticed it. She read the letter twice. Then she went to the attic and brought down Silas's notebook and opened it to the first entry from 1861. Her grandfather had started the notebook because he was observing things he thought mattered and had no one to tell. He had kept it for 23 years in the expectation, or perhaps only the hope, that someone would eventually find it worth reading. Someone in Morgantown had read a sketch in a publication and written a letter. She wrote back that same afternoon, 2 careful pages in her own slanting hand, describing the breeding lines as she understood them from the notebook and from her own observations over the past 15 months. She mentioned the lateral pressure effect Tadgy had noticed on the Wren property. She mentioned the winter hardiness numbers. She did not send the notebook itself, because the notebook was not hers to send, it was Silas's, and it belonged in the trunk in the attic until she understood better what she was dealing with. She mailed the letter from Hetty Moss's store on Thursday and did not mention it to anyone. The professor wrote back in 3 weeks. His second letter was longer and less formal than the first. The correspondence had moved into a different register, one of genuine interest rather than professional inquiry. He asked specific questions about the comb morphology she had described, about the leg coloring, about delaying persistence through short days. He mentioned 3 published works on heritage breed genetics that he thought she might find useful, and he offered to send copies. The books arrived in April, wrapped in brown paper. She read them the way she had read Silas's notebook slowly, at the kitchen table in the evenings, with the green notebook open beside her for annotation. Some of what they contained she already knew from the notebook. Some of it revised what the notebook had assumed. 2 passages described, in academic language, precisely the things Silas had been arguing in plain language since 1871, that the heritage lines carried genetic resilience, that the commercial breeds had traded away for faster weight gain, and that the trade had a cost that would eventually present itself. The day is coming, Silas had written. I have tried to say this. No one listens to a man talking about chickens. The professor at Morgantown was listening. He was in his own careful way, saying the same thing in different rooms, to different people, with different tools. She found something unexpectedly sustaining in the parallel, the idea that the argument had been going on simultaneously in more than one place, carried by more than one person, without any of them knowing about the others. She wrote back and mentioned Silas's notebook for the first time. She described it briefly. 23 years, begun in 1861, breeding records combined with what she could only call argument. She said the argument had turned out to be correct. His response came in 2 weeks, faster than the previous letters. He said he would very much like to read the notebook if she was ever willing to share it, and that he understood if she was not. He said the work she was describing was, in his view, not a curiosity but a demonstration, and that demonstrations of this kind were rare and worth documenting properly. She kept that letter in the back of the green notebook, folded to the size of a bookmark. Spring arrived in the usual incremental way, and with it a change she had not anticipated. People began arriving at the end of the drive on days other than Saturday. It started with a farmer from Clay County who had heard about the grazing service from a man at a cattle auction in Sutton, who had heard about it from Percival Stout, who had heard about it from Rufus Ewan. The line of transmission was 5 people long, which meant the information had traveled 40 miles in 2 county lines and had arrived not as rumor but as reported fact. The Clay County farmer stood at the folding table on a Wednesday morning and said he had 120 acres of mixed pasture and hay that had been losing ground to grasshoppers for 4 seasons, and he wanted to know if she could help. She told him she could schedule him for July. He said he would take July. She wrote his name in the notebook. By the end of March, she had filled July and August and had begun scheduling into September, which meant she was committing the flock 8 months in advance, which required a level of record-keeping precision that the green notebook had not been designed for. She bought a second notebook in April red, also cloth-bound, from the dry goods counter at Hetty Moss's store and began keeping the scheduling records there. The green notebook remained the record of the flock itself, the birds, the breeding, the health, the numbers. The red notebook became the record of the work the birds did in the world. She had not planned for 2 notebooks. She had planned for $40 worth of chicks nobody wanted. The notebooks were what happened when you did the next thing that needed doing, and then the next thing after that, over and over, for a year and a half, without stopping to ask whether you were allowed to be this far along. Opal turned 82 in May. There was no celebration because Opal did not want one. Willa came down the ridge on the Tuesday nearest to the date with the biscuit tin, and they sat in Opal's kitchen and talked about the laying rates and the fence schedule and the letter from the professor in Morgantown. And Opal listened to all of it in the particular way she listened fully, without interruption, with the kind of attention that made you realize partway through that you were saying more than you had planned to say. When Willa had finished, Opal set her cup down on the saucer with the deliberateness she applied to every small action. The man in Morgantown. He thinks what your grandfather did matters. He thinks what's in the notebook matters. He wants to read it. Opal looked at the window, where the egg from the first laying sat in its bowl on the sill, unchanged. Silas would not have sent it. I know. He didn't trust the college men. He thought they would take the ideas and put their own names on them. He may have been right about that. He was right about most things he spent time thinking about. I'm not sending the notebook. I'm corresponding about what's in it. That's different. Opal considered this distinction. He wrote it to be read, she said finally. He didn't write it to stay in a trunk. That was the end of the conversation about the notebook. Willa walked back up the ridge with the biscuit tin under her arm and the weight of her grandmother's words doing something in the back of her mind that was not quite decision and not quite resolution but something between the two. The grasshoppers came back that summer worse than they had been. Not worse in the narrow sense of slightly worse, worse in the sense that the county extension mans stopped pretending it was anything other than what it was. The Grantsville Weekly ran a front-page piece in the 3rd week of June using the word infestation without hedging it, and the piece quoted the extension man as saying the spray programs had produced diminishing returns for 3 consecutive seasons, and that alternative management approaches were worth serious consideration. Willa read that quote twice. She set the paper on the kitchen table and went out to check the north fence line, and when she came back she found Tadji standing at the table reading the same article. He's not naming us, Tadji said. He doesn't know about us specifically. He knows about the principal. Taj set the paper down. He will. The inquiries that had been arriving on weekdays through the spring became something closer to a procession through July. Hetty Moss ran out of space on the ledger page she had been using to record messages for the Ridge and started a second page, and she mentioned this to Willa on a Thursday, in a tone that was not quite complaint and not quite wonder but somewhere in the vicinity of both. Willa answered every inquiry. She turned none away. She told some of them she could not reach them until October, and 2 of them said they would wait. She kept the price at $2 a week per 100 birds and did not negotiate it in either direction. The operation that summer ran 6 grazing crews across 11 properties in 3 counties, with Owen managing the eastern rotation and Tad G handling the western one and Blythe running the home flock and the egg stand on Saturdays, which had grown from a folding table to a small open-sided shed Willa had framed in May from salvaged lumber. The shed had a chalkboard for the week's prices and a hand-painted sign above the opening that said nothing except Breck Slateback Hollow, because the name was sufficient and the location told anyone who already knew what they needed to know. She had not named the operation. The name had arrived the way the second notebook had arrived, as the consequence of a thing that had grown past the point where it could remain unnamed. People had started referring to it as the Breck Place, or the Slateback Hollow Birds, and she had let those names be the names. On a Tuesday morning in the second week of August, Opal did not answer the door. Willa had come down the ridge at the usual time with the biscuit tin, and the door of the small frame house was closed. She knocked and waited and knocked again. And then she opened the door, because the door was not locked, and found her grandmother in the back bedroom, lying in the particular stillness that is different from sleep. She had gone in the night, quietly, without distress, in the bed she had slept in for 50 years, with the house around her that she had lived in since she married Silas Breck in 1845. Willa sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. She did not cry then. The grief was present, but had not yet found its form the way a thing is present before it has a shape. She went through the house room by room, touching the things her grandmother had touched: the cast iron pot on the stove, the worn smooth handle of the hand loom in the corner, the brown coveralls on the hook by the back door, shaped still to the body that had worn them. On the kitchen table there was an envelope with Willa's name on it, in Opal's careful hand, the same hand as Silas's, because they had learned to write at the same school in the same year. Their letters formed by the same teacher with the same method, so that even after 40 years of living their separate versions of a shared life, the handwriting had stayed close enough that at a glance you could not always tell whose it was. 3 lines inside. The house is yours. The books in the trunk are yours. Tell Taj. That was all. 2 words at the end, with the weight of everything Opal had understood about what was being built on the ridge and who would carry it forward and when the time would come. Willa folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket and walked back up the ridge to do what needed doing: the minister, the arrangements, the notification of the few remaining people who had known Opal Breck long enough to need to be told in person. The 2 words stayed in her pocket like a stone she had picked up without deciding to carry, the kind that turns out to fit the hand so exactly that you have stopped noticing its weight before you realize you are still holding it. The service was held on a Saturday in a church in Grantsville, where Opal had occupied the 3rd pew from the front for 58 years, reliably, without requiring acknowledgement of the reliability. The minister said this. He said it as the specific and unremarkable fact that it was, the way Opal herself would have wanted a fact said without decoration. Court Dillard came hat in hand and sat near the back. Rufus Ewan came and sat in the 2nd pew, the way a man sits when he intends to be present rather than merely attending. Percival Stout came with his wife. Hetty Moss came and brought a covered dish and set it on the table in the fellowship room without comment. The man who had sold Willa her first stock cart from over in Gilmer County drove the 40 miles down and stood at the back of the church in his good coat. The cook from Charleston, who had first come up the hollow for eggs, tied her horse outside and signed the memorial book in a careful, unhurried hand and stood through the service without leaning on anything. Tadgee came in a suit that had belonged to his father. It did not fit him across the shoulders, which were wider than his father's had been at his age, and he sat in the 2nd row beside Blythe and Owen with his hands folded in his lap, and after the graveside committal, he stood at the edge of the churchyard with the look of a man who has not yet found the right arrangement for an emotion that has not finished arriving. Willa walked to where he stood. She told him her grandmother had left a note. She said it had 3 lines. She told him the first 2 lines and then she told him the 3rd. He took it in without reaction, which was his way. She never said anything to me directly. She said something once. Willa was remembering what Opal had told her the previous November, standing in the new building in the cedar smell and the warmth. She came up to the building when you were working alone in the evenings. She watched you move the birds. She told me you had the hands. Tadgee looked at the middle distance for a moment. A sound came from somewhere across the churchyard. Birds. Ordinary birds. Sparrows in the maple near the fence, and he turned slightly toward the sound without meaning to, the way a person turns toward a familiar voice. She told me something once, he said. I was moving the east section on a Wednesday evening, the September before last. She was standing in the doorway. She watched for a while and then she said, "You are the one." I didn't know what she meant. I thought maybe she was confused. He was quiet for a moment. She wasn't confused. They stood at the edge of the grave in the September light, and the understanding that passed between them did not require further words, because Opal Breck had already supplied the words, 2 years in advance, to the two people who needed to receive them, in the specific order and at the specific moment she had intended. She had managed the whole thing the way she managed everything, quietly, precisely, without wasted motion, far ahead of when anyone else would have thought to begin. Willa put her hand briefly on Tadji's shoulder and walked back to the wagon. The following Monday morning, she gave him the key to the workshop and a copy of the red scheduling notebook, which she had transcribed over the weekend. She set the key and the notebook on the workbench and told him the October schedule was in the first section and the spring commitments were in the second, and that the price did not change and the method did not change, and the notebook would tell him everything else he needed. He picked up the key. He did not ask what it meant, because he already knew. Because Opal had told him 2 years ago in an empty building on a Wednesday evening, and he had been carrying the knowledge ever since without knowing quite what to do with it. She moved the contents of the small frame house up the ridge in October. Not all of it. Opal had not owned much, and some of what she owned was worn past use. But the cast iron pot and the hand loom and the brown coveralls and the memorial book from the service and the egg bowl from the windowsill, that egg, which had been sitting on the sill since December of 1884, unchanged, unremarked, doing the thing Opal had set it there to do, which was simply to exist as evidence that the first laying had happened and been witnessed. All of it came up the ridge to the big house. She put the egg bowl on the windowsill of the big house kitchen, the same position it had occupied in the frame house, and left it there. The frame house she left standing. It was sound. The roof was good. Leaving a sound building to deteriorate was not something her family did, and she did not intend to start. The third building went up that fall. She had not planned it for that fall specifically, but the demand from the summer had strained the flock's capacity in ways that showed clearly in the red notebook, and 2 of the September commitments had required her to pull birds from the home-laying rotation, which had reduced the egg sales for 3 consecutive Saturdays and produced a gap in the right-hand column that she did not like looking at. She sourced lumber from 2 different barns in Gilmer County that were being taken down in preparation for winter, paying in cash the way she paid for everything. Tadji framed the third building on the footprint of the old smokehouse, which sat 20 feet north of the second building and shared its elevation, so that all 3 long, low structures ran parallel to each other up the length of the ridge. The vent height was 32 inches. The floor was on cedar sleepers. The south shutters ran on a single rope. She did not need to consult the notebook for these specifications. They were in her hands. Now the way the chains were in her hands. The knowledge that had begun as reading and become, over 2.5 years of daily physical repetition, something more like instinct. Owen shingled the third roof. Blythe built the nest boxes. Tadji installed the lamp hardware and ran the rope for the shutters. And when he tied off the cleat at the bottom, he coiled the excess the way Willa coiled it, which was the way the drawing in Silas's notebook showed it, which was the way that made sense. By the time the first hard freeze came in November, the third building held 400 birds. 3 buildings, 1,200 birds total. 4 people doing the work in addition to Willa herself. 6 grazing crews. The red notebook had 47 names in it across the first 2 sections and had begun a third section for the following year. The banker from Grantsville came up the hollow in December for the second time, bringing a satchel with a folder inside it, her name on the tab in typewritten letters, which told her the visit had been prepared for rather than improvised. He stood in the yard and explained what he had come to say with the careful efficiency of a man who has rehearsed a presentation and is delivering it as planned. The operation had come to the bank's attention through various reports. The bank was in a position to offer substantial capital for expansion buildings, equipment, additional stock, whatever she needed. The terms were favorable. Willa listened to all of it. When he had finished, she asked him what the interest rate was. He told her. She thanked him and said she would not be borrowing. He opened the folder and produced a single page of figures showing what the operation could grow into with the capital versus without it. The gap between the 2 projections was substantial. She looked at the page for a moment, then looked up at him. Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do, she said, and the future doesn't like being told. He blinked. She handed the page back before he could respond. Something my grandfather wrote. He wrote it in 9,867, and he was right about it then, and it's still right. I'll have 3 more buildings by spring and 6 by fall, and I'll pay for them the way I've paid for everything else. I appreciate the offer. He took the page. He looked at the 3 buildings running parallel up the ridge behind her, the second and third ones still carrying the pale brightness of new-cut lumber. Whatever he had been expecting to see up here, this was not precisely it. She could see that in the way he looked, not with doubt, but with the recalibration of a man whose estimate has been revised by evidence. If you change your mind, I won't. Not unkindly. A simple fact. He rode back down the hollow, and she turned back to the building and went inside to check the lamp chains. Because it was evening and she checked the lamp chains every evening, And some things did not change because there was no reason to change them. The winter of the third year was the worst in recent memory for the county, but not for the ridge. Two of the valley farms lost stock in a cold snap in January that dropped the temperature to something even the old men at the feed store needed a moment to produce a comparable for. The Grantsville Weekly ran a piece about it in the language of a community that has been through this before, but not quite like this. Willa read the piece at the kitchen table and felt the particular sorrow of knowing there was nothing to be done for something that had already happened. And then she checked the lamp chains in all three buildings and went to bed. 0 birds lost. The cedar floor did its work. The vents at 32 inches did their work. The south shutters on their single rope did their work. Raised in the morning by Tadgee and Owen and lowered in the evening by whoever was last to leave, the way Silas had designed them to be operated by one person, with one hand, because the other hand was usually carrying something. The professor from Morgantown wrote in February with a question that stopped her midway through reading it. He had been reviewing the breeding records she had shared with him over the previous year and had identified what he believed was a genetic line within the flock that had not been documented elsewhere, a specific combination of traits. The rust-colored plumage pattern, combined with the leg coloring, combined with the unusual laying persistence in reduced light conditions, that did not appear in any of the published breed registries he had access to. He wanted to know where the original breeding stock had come from before Silas acquired it. She went to the attic and brought down Silas's notebook and read the first entry from 1861 more carefully than she had read it before. Silas had acquired the original stock from his own father. His father had gotten it from his father before that, in the 1820s, from a neighbor who was dispersing a flock before moving west. The neighbor's name was in the notebook, one line, no further information. The line went back past the notebooks, beginning further than Silas's record-keeping, further than his father's record-keeping, possibly further than anyone's record-keeping. She wrote to the professor that she could trace the line to 1861 with certainty, and before that only by inference, and that the before that was a neighbor's name and a direction of travel and nothing else. She said she thought the line might be older than the county. His response came in 3 weeks. He said the genetic traits he was observing were consistent with a pre-commercial line, possibly introduced to West Virginia before systematic breed registration had begun in the country, and that if she was willing to allow him to send a colleague to observe the flock in person, he thought it could constitute a significant find. She wrote back that she was willing. She did not tell anyone about the exchange. She was not ready to assign it a meaning yet, because assigning a meaning to a thing before you understood it was how you ended up with the wrong meaning, and the wrong meaning was harder to correct than no meaning at all. Spring arrived, and with it the fourth building. She had said 6 by fall to the banker, which had been accurate at the time and remained accurate in April when Tadgee and Owen broke ground on the fourth footprint, using the stone foundation of a collapsed root cellar on the north end of the cleared ground above the original long house. This one she did not build from memory. She opened Silas's notebook to the drawing and propped it against the workbench and had Blythe hold it open while she measured the vent placement on the framing, because the difference between 32 inches and 31.5 inches was a difference that showed in the birds over a winter, and she had the data to prove it now in her own hand across 3 winters in 2 buildings, and she was not interested in letting precision drift. Tadgee had taken on the scheduling work without being asked to, in the specific way she had meant when she gave him the red notebook, not just executing the existing commitments, but developing new ones, following up with the properties that had been on rotation for a second season, negotiating the multi-property agreements in the southern part of the county where several neighboring farms wanted to coordinate the timing of the grazing rotations. He did this in person, riding out on Thursdays, which was not a day she had designated for anything. He had simply identified Thursday as the right day for the rides, based on his reading of which farms were likely to have their men available for conversation, and he had been correct. She noticed this not with surprise, but with the particular quality of attention she gave to things that were working well, a quality she had inherited from Silas Breck without knowing it, which was to observe a good thing carefully enough to understand why it was good, so you could replicate the conditions rather than just hoping the good thing continued. She wrote in the green notebook, TM manages the Thursday rotation independently. No loss of relationship continuity with any property. Method, observe, then move. Same as with the birds. It was the same observation she had made about him 18 months ago, when he was 17 and lifting fence stakes on the Stout property. The observation had not changed. What had changed was the scale of what the observation meant. The 5th building went up in June and the 6th in September. On schedule, both built with lumber paid for in cash, both built to the specification in Silas's notebook, both joined by the same rope and cleat shutter system that Blythe had refined over the previous year into something that operated more smoothly than the original and required less maintenance without sacrificing any of the ventilation function. By the end of the 4th summer, the operation was running 4,000 birds across 6 buildings on the ridge, with 6 grazing crews working properties across 3 counties and the egg sales on Saturdays requiring 2 people to manage the shed because the volume had outgrown what one person could handle. The cook from Charleston had begun including the eggs in a standing weekly order delivered by arrangement on Fridays, and 2 other establishments had asked to be added to the same arrangement. Professor's colleague arrived in August and spent 2 days on the ridge, quiet and methodical, making his own notebook the 3rd or 4th notebook to have been filled with observations about these birds, if you counted Silas's and the green one and the red one. Before he left, he stood in the doorway of the original building and looked at the vents and the floor and the single-rope shutters with the look of a man who has just understood something he was expecting to understand differently. The building design, he said, it's not standard.
My grandfather designed it. When?
1851. He built it for this specific breeding line. He understood what the birds needed before the published literature had a framework for it. The colleague looked at the notebook entry. She showed him the drawing of the hen, with the particular comb and leg coloring, the note that said, this is what they look like. The vents and the cedar sleepers, drawn in precise pencil below it. He looked at it for a long time. How much of this was his intuition and how much was observation? He didn't separate them, she said. He thought separating them was how you miss things. That answer stayed with the colleague. She watched him write it in his own notebook before he looked up. He shook her hand at the gate and rode back down the hollow, and his letter in September said the flock represented, in his professional assessment, the best preserved example of pre-commercial dual-purpose heritage genetics in the state of West Virginia, and possibly in the region, and that he intended to say so in print. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. She thought of Silas writing in the notebook in 1877. I have tried to say this. No one listens to a man talking about chickens. Someone was listening now. A great many people were listening in Grantsville and in Charleston and in Morgantown and across 3 counties of West Virginia and soon in print. The argument that had been made in 23 years of patient private record keeping was becoming, slowly and by its own momentum, a thing the world was catching up to. It was in the 3rd week of October of that 4th year, on a morning with frost still on the ridge grass and the light coming in thin and gold from the east, that she heard from Hetty Moss that the hatchery up in Tennessee was sending another lot of mixed heritage chicks down to the Calhoun County barn to be sold, and that the auctioneer was not expecting any bids. She did not plan the trip the way she might have planned something that felt like a decision. She simply found herself, the following Tuesday morning, telling Tadgee to handle the day's fence rotation without her, hitching the horse to the old wagon, and driving down the ridge with the canvas flap on the wagon bed, already lifted at the corners, because the habit of it was in her hands, before the thought of it was fully in her mind. The barn was the same. The smell was the same. The lamp hung from the same roof beam over the same stretch of concrete floor. The auctioneer was the same man, 4 years grayer, and he looked up when she came through the wide door and nodded at her, in the way he nodded at people he recognized as buyers, which was a different nod from the one he had given her the first time she walked through that door. She walked past the calf pens without stopping, past the goats, all the way to the back. There were 800 of them this time, in the same shallow cardboard flats, peeping in the same thin, uneven way, and 2 had already gone still in the flat closest to the door. The men at the front of the barn had not walked back to look. Willa crouched down on her heels and looked at the chicks, in the particular silence she had learned meant she was paying the kind of attention that needed quiet around it. Tadge was not with her. She had come alone, the way she had come alone the first time, and the sameness of that was not lost on her. She crouched there long enough that a different boy this time, younger than Tadgee had been, came over to ask if she needed help. She asked what the hatchery wanted for the lot. He said they had said anything. Just take them. She stood and walked to the office and came back with a receipt. The price was $30. She paid $40 because it had been $40 the first time, and she was paying something that was not exactly a debt and not exactly a tribute, but something between the two that did not have a better name. She began loading the flats one at a time into the wagon bed. She had the last flat in her hands when she heard a step behind her, a particular sound, unhurried, deliberate, the step of a man who had ridden some distance in cold weather to arrive at a moment he had been thinking about since he heard about it from Hetty Moss. Court Dillard was not wearing his clean wool coat. He was wearing the coat he wore on working days, which was older and stained at the cuffs, and was the coat of a man who had come directly from his own work without stopping to change. Because changing would have meant the moment mattered more than he wanted to admit it did. He had his hat in his hand. I heard you were coming down, he said. News travels. He looked at the flats in the wagon bed, at the 800 chicks peeping in the thin, uneven way of things that are cold and underfed and still alive. These are the ones, aren't they? These are the ones. He was quiet for a moment with his hat in both hands, turning the brim slowly the way men turn things when they are trying to find a way to say something that does not come easily to them. Your grandfather would be proud of what you've built up there. She looked at him steadily. I think he is. Court nodded at that. He did not say anything else about it, because there was nothing else to say about it, and he was a man who had learned, over the past 4 years, that Willa Breck understood the value of not over-explaining a thing. Put his hat back on his head. I'll see you Monday. Got another 40 acres I'd like to discuss. Monday, she said. He walked back to his horse and rode out of the lot without looking back, which was the same thing she had done 4 years ago. And she understood that it was not coincidence but a kind of completion, the way a thing closes that needed to close, without announcement, without ceremony, simply by arriving at the place it was always going. She climbed onto the wagon bench. She sat for a moment with the reins in her hands and looked through the open front of the barn at the road that led back towards Slateback Hollow Road and the ridge and the 6 buildings running parallel up the slope in the order she had built them, the oldest one showing its years in the weathered silver of the chestnut planking. She looked at the barn she had walked out of 4 years before with 1,000 chicks nobody wanted, and she felt finally the thing she had not allowed herself to feel that first morning, not triumph, not vindication, but something quieter and older than either, which was the feeling of a person who has been told that what she is holding is not worth much and has lived long enough to watch the world correct itself. She clicked to the horse and drove out of the lot. The road home was the same road it had always been, past the Ewan place, across the creek twice, up the gravel switchbacks to the ridge where Silas Breck had built the farmhouse in 1851 from chestnut salvaged from a barn that had stood on the same footprint for 60 years before him. The house was still standing. The long, low building he had built for these was still standing. 5 more buildings stood beside it now, and the one he had built was the oldest of them, its chestnut planking gone, the particular silver gray of wood that has stood through 30 winters and knows how to stand through 30 more. She pulled the wagon up to the yard and climbed down and began carrying the flats one at a time into the original building, the one Silas had built, and set them on the wooden floor he had laid, and lit the brooder lamps, and stood in the cool dim with the smell of old straw and older wood and 800 chicks she had paid $40 for. She did not feel the weight settle onto her shoulders the way she had felt it settle 4 years ago. The weight was still there, it would always be there, in the way that the things you have built and the things you have lost and the things you have carried forward all become part of what you are made of. But it had changed so completely in 4 years that calling it weight was no longer quite accurate. It was simply the shape of her. The way the long, low building was the shape of what Silas had understood, and she had continued. The way the 6 buildings on the ridge were the shape of what happens when you do the next thing that needs doing, and then the next thing after that, without stopping to ask whether you are allowed to be this far along. Taj appeared in the doorway. He had seen the wagon come up the ridge and had come over without being called. The way he came to things now, reading the situation and moving into it before anyone had to ask. He looked at the 800 chicks in their flats on the floor his grandfather and Method's father had laid, and he did not say anything for a moment. Then he looked at her. The rust-colored ones, he said. They've got the leg coloring, I know. He crossed to the nearest water trough and began filling it from the bucket without being told, because he had the hands, and he was the one, and Opal Breck had known it before either of them had. The way she had known everything that mattered before it happened, before anyone else thought to look. From 81 years of watching and learning what watching was for. Willa stood in the doorway of the building Silas had built for these birds before she was born, and watched 800 chicks that nobody had wanted that morning slowly remember that they were alive. And she understood, without needing to write it down, that this was not a beginning and not an ending but a continuation, the kind that does not announce itself, that simply goes on in the way that true things go on, quietly and without ceasing, in the care of the people who know what to look for.